Had a lot of really interesting audience questions, such as, what about that state that paints the river green for a certain holiday? What certain holiday are you talking about? Joe Ryan knows. Where do you get your money? Well, that's an entire day's conference. So where's my, Len Hang and Peter? Come on up and join Michael and I. I'm sorry. We're going to wrap up. I appreciate you sticking with us. And I hope you appreciate the extraordinary expertise we were able to put together today. I learned an awful lot and am most appreciative. And I do want to give a special recognition to Lai Len Hang, who gets the award for traveling the farthest to the conference. But given everything we were talking about today, it really would have been an incomplete discussion without a first-hand witness about the example of Singapore, which is remains a remarkable example. Though I'm sorry you didn't get a better reception for the strict top-down governance that. Not to say we're not having that right now. So, following up on the fact we had a lot of questions we couldn't answer from the audience, there was one that was repeated in several different ways that I thought it'd be a great one for us to tackle, because it really is a generic question, whether we're talking at the national level, the state level, the federal level, and we're talking about solutions. And we're talking about solutions, and that is, what about the people who get left out? Decision-making and policy-making is often done at a very high level. There's no question, I think this previous panel in particular, and some of the discussions we had in our other panels, that things have to happen at the local level. You have to have a local constituency, especially these days, that the thing that got in the way of the contract with America was a popular opinion. But there's also a pretty strong criticism, and legitimate in many ways, of American environmentalism and the environmental movement, probably environmentalism all over the world, that there is a certain economic strata, there's a certain group of people who dominate that way of thinking, and the most affected people might not necessarily be those people. So how do we solve that problem, or how do we address that issue? How do we make sure we're bringing more people into the fold? And I'll add, I think this last election maybe gave us some lessons about that. I realize it's electoral college distribution. By the way, I feel compelled to say this. For those of you who think that Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 3 million, go back and look at the numbers. He lost by 10.66 million popular votes, actually. And if you want me to explain that to you later, I will. But there is a part of the population that there was criticism that we're not reached out to enough during this election, and I think it spreads out to environmentalism to a certain extent. Are we reaching out, and who are we leaving out?
Can I take a shot at that?
Absolutely.
So I want to kind of speak for and with this community groups that we've worked with, and I think in part to answer that question, it's about time. Particularly a lot of more vulnerable communities, oftentimes nobody pays attention to them until they need something in that community. We want to put a green infrastructure project in there, we want to put a park in there, and suddenly you're just an outsider coming in trying to do things that benefit you, and you haven't spent the time that you need to invest in a community, getting to know them, getting to know the stakeholders, getting to know what they want, whether they even want the things that are in there. And what I often see, I have the luxury of being an academic, so I'm not on the same time scale as everybody else, but what I often see is, businesses work on a different time scale, governments work on a different time scale, and communities work on a time scale. So somewhere in this conversation, I think, about how to get more people to the table. It's about doing that front-end work, the investment in the community, investment in paying attention to what they want, so that by the time you're actually doing the things, they don't feel like they are abstract to you, or that you're just taking advantage of them. And frankly, time is the hardest part.
Yeah, so let me add to that. And let me preface this by saying I know for a fact that I'm not the best spokesman for this issue of environmental justice questions, and maybe somebody else should have been on this panel. But my institute works very closely in that field. We helped create and spun off an independent group called the West Oakland Indicators Project, that is a community-based organization that has worked on poverty and environmental justice issues in Oakland. And we helped to create and spin off another group called the Environmental Justice Coalition for Water in California that was the first to bring together environmental justice groups around water issues in California. They're both now independent 501c3s, and they are the experts in addressing some of these questions. But I agree they're absolutely critical. And just to make two comments on the international scale, one of the things that I said in my talk was I think we need to rethink supply, that some of the traditional approaches we use won't work for the 21st century. But I think I also said that there are places around the world where we need some of the traditional infrastructure that was built, the dams, the aqueducts, the central systems. And I don't know if I said this, but I'll say it now. I think that's true, but I also believe that those systems have to be built in a different way than they were built in the 20th century. We would build a dam, somebody would build a dam with no consultation with local communities, not caring what happened to ecological communities that depended on fisheries, not caring about what happened to communities that might be flooded by the reservoir behind a big dam. And so part of the nuance of my argument would be, if we build that kind of infrastructure, it absolutely has to be built to a different set of standards that include maybe what we call environmental justice or community issues in ways that we have failed to do that in the past. The other comment I wanted to make at the international level is one of the things we learned in the 20th century about water supply and sanitation projects was that the projects that were not built with community participation, where some well-meaning international aid or agency or well-meaning NGO goes in and drills a well somewhere and leaves, is that those projects had an enormous failure rate. And conversely, when a project is designed with the local community and the control is given to the local community, and the nuances about who's going to be responsible for repairing it, and how repairs are going to be done, and who manages it, and how's money collected to maintain it. When those kinds of things were built in, the projects were much, much more successful, especially for when those communities and decision-makings included women, who often were bearing the brunt of the failure to provide safe water because they were walking the farthest, they didn't have educational opportunities to collect clean water, they were having to deal with the consequences of ill health associated with bad water, and that made a huge difference for women and children especially. So.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to speak generally about, first about Singapore, and then the international position. Now, in the early years, when the government decided to clean up the river, etc., it was and still is a top-down decision, mainly because the local people were not educated enough to understand what was good, so there's no point consulting them. The government knew they were on the right track. They had to clean up the river, so they proceeded, right? But today, it's different. We have people who are very well educated and people who come to the forefront to help the government. So for example, we have a group called the River Watch, and they are just ordinary people. Every weekend, they go on a boat and they help fish out all the garbage, that's some of which is still in the river. In the developing countries these days, there is an urge to build bigger and bigger dams. And it's tied to the issue of corruption because the government takes a cut, right? And the issue now, I mean, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank is very wary of this now. So they do not encourage large dams, but smaller dams to bring clean electricity is good, right? So there's a need to educate these people and to stop these big dams. There is an international rivers network that keeps a lookout on this. I'll give you an example. In my part of the world, now Malaysia has got two parts, East and West Malaysia. East Malaysia is comprises Sarawak and Sabah, which is in the island of Borneo. Now, the Malaysian government built a huge dam there that floods an area larger than the size of Singapore. It's hard to imagine, but the dam is built now. You can Google it. It's called the Bakun Dam, B-A-K-U-N, Bakun. Now, when it was built, the intention was to supply electricity to mainland Malaysia, which is West Malaysia, and the two are separated by the South China Sea, a huge body of water, right? So they did an EIA and didn't address this question. And the International Rivers Network tore their EIA to shreds and said, what's the point of doing this? When you haven't explored the viability and the cost of transporting this to mainland Malaysia, you have to do underground cables. How much of this power is going to be lost? Anyway, so they decided subsequently to proceed with the dam and not build the underground cables. So they are only supplying energy to Sarawak. Indonesia doesn't need their energy. Indonesia has lots of energy. So do you need a dam that size? And who's buying it? So now they are trying to get Chinese companies to come and invest in East Malaysia, particularly for the aluminium industry. Apparently, the aluminium industry needs a lot of energy. Okay? So these are issues, and the other thing is the point that Peter just made. In the course of building that dam, they had to resettle native people. And this is a really interesting story because an international advocate from Switzerland took a keen interest in the local people there. The native people were a group called the Penans, P-E-N-A-N-S, right? So this Swiss activist, his name was Bruno Manser, and he wrote a letter to Mahathir, the Prime Minister of Malaysia then, and he asked him, why do you want to do this? And what is really interesting, and I use this as an example of the North-South debate. So Mahathir said, it's all very well for you, a Swiss activist, to criticize me because you live in a very sophisticated city, right? And you're just enchanted by the plight of these native people. You think it's very exotic. But when you're tired of it all, you can go back to your very comfortable Swiss chalet. But I'm the Prime Minister of this country. I don't want my people to live in trees. I want them to have power. You see? So it is a very interesting perspective. The letters between these two gentlemen were somehow sent to a magazine, and it was published, the Far Eastern Economic Review, right? Now, what has happened to Bruno Manser is he was not allowed to go back to Sarawak, but he slipped in, and he's disappeared, and he's never seen again. So more than 7 years has passed, and legally he has been declared dead. It has been mentioned in Time magazine, etc. But it's very interesting when you look at these issues, you see, because no one knows what happened to him. So there we have these challenges. And finally, I want to make mention of when governments do these big development projects, they have to relocate the people. And they have to ensure that the process is fair, transparent, equitable. And Peter mentioned the issues of women. Now, women who are not given water, I mean, women have always been disadvantaged, right? They walk for hours just collecting water to bring back to the village, right? And when they are displaced, they are often not given the same compensation amounts. They're given smaller amounts than the men. And I've actually done a study on this for the Asian Development Bank. And basically, this is very unfair. So again, the compensation to women should be fair. We also found out that, this is anecdotal, but when the men get the compensation, they usually spend it very quickly, right? They spend it on wine, women, and a motorbike. So that's an added reason.
That doesn't sound anecdotal.
That's an added
That sounds
reason
like hard data to
to
me.
give women even more money, if we want to say. But at least they should be given equal to the men. All right, I'll stop here.
So there was a lot of discussion today over each panel in one way or another about reasons to be optimistic, reasons to be pessimistic. And I want to ask you each to talk about it. Given the things we've talked about today, given the political realities of America, given the global challenges, the national challenges, what are our reasons to be optimistic or pessimistic, or maybe better put, what are our paths forward, and what's going to keep us standing on our tracks?
I'd be happy to go. I think like a lot of people here, this is a very nuanced answer. In truth, I see lots of things for optimism and lots of things for concern. Oh, thank you. But I would say that one of the things that really gives me optimism is a shift, or at least a stronger prominence of values in our conversations. I think if we'd had this conversation, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, certainly the audience would have probably been smaller, and it would probably been a lot more policy and technology focused. And I think the fact that we talk about what's important to us, the things that we want, what we want to see, we talk about equity and justice, we think about comparisons between different places. This really brings value to our not to use that word multiple times, but it brings value to how we think about and have these conversations. So to me, that makes us look forward and say, all right, hopefully we won't be making these decisions the way we have for 30 years, because we know there's risk in that we can make decisions with some mistakes, but with values more integrated. And I think that particularly speaks to what Peter was saying. In any case, I think that's where I'll stop.
So I'm an optimist, with the understanding that what's that expression, an optimist is just a poorly informed pessimist. As I hope during my talk, I said, I believe inevitably we're going to move to a sustainable system. But I also said the challenge is dealing with the bad consequences between here and there. That's the path that we take and how long it takes. I believe inevitably the population of the planet is going to level off. So this isn't true for me, and it's not true for some of the older people in the audience, but I suspect for some of the younger people in the audience, you don't know it yet, but one of the most remarkable days in human history is going to happen in your lifetime, and that's the day when the population of the planet is smaller than it was the day before, when we peak and start to go down, and it'll be 9 billion or 10 billion. It's going to be bad news, but it's going to start to go down, and then a whole set of different challenges next century are going to arise about how the world deals with a declining population. Some countries are starting to deal with that now. But if we can get to sustainable management of water and energy, and if we can more quickly address climate change and some of these other large-scale problems, I think that's why I'm in the long run optimistic. The other reason I'm optimistic is that I see every day examples of remarkable success stories going on. The last panel was really sort of exciting to see the local on-the-ground things that are happening. And I see it all the time in California, and we see it all around the world. And the trick is see those success stories, figure out why they're successful, and move them to scale. And I think that's really part of the operational challenge of moving on this new path.
I'm also very optimistic. I think, I started my talk right at the beginning by saying it's very important to have good governance, and good governance requires a holistic look at the entire picture. So at least in my country, it's important to have strong leaders who are on the right path, right? And then the people follow. But I can see that when the people are well educated, they too, as in the US, can initiate change, right? I was quite interested in the story of the Bronx River. It was mentioned that it's polluted. So what are the solutions? Who's going to start cleaning up the Bronx River, right? So that is my question. Should it be the government? Should it be the people pushing the government, right? And how do the laws come in here? I'll share, in Singapore, we've got a law that I think it's quite good. And basically, it's a law that reverses the onus of proof. This would shock American lawyers. But we have a law that says you're not supposed to discharge pollutive substances into the waters. So if the government inspectors come onto your factory and they find pollutive stuff in your drains, then the company is presumed to have done it. So the government doesn't have to prove anything. You've got the stuff, you're guilty, right? And then we have a law that goes on to say, if the company is guilty, the company can be fined so much, but the officers of the company can be jailed. And it goes on to say, of course, you can't jail the company, you jail the officers of the company. And it goes on to have mandatory jail. If the directors or officers of the company are found guilty a second or subsequent time, there is mandatory jail up to 12 months. Okay? So this is really frightening the companies into compliance. I'm a law professor, so I don't practice law, but I've got friends who are in practice, and one day my friend called up and said, "Oh, Lin Heng, I've got this client who's been charged a second time, and under this law, there's mandatory jail. Now, what would you advise?" And I said, look down further in the law. There's one provision that says, no prosecutions without the sanction of the Attorney General's office. So I said, so you go negotiate with the AG's people. And that's what she did. Because she was telling me her client was so nervous, he was thinking of migrating because he thought he'll be jailed. But she negotiated, and they gave him a second chance. So that's the role of lawyers. The law is there, okay? But it does push companies to really give of their best. So I think that's a good law, reversing the onus of proof. I thought I'll share it with you. Okay? And I mean, in the end, the citizens all must play a role and, if possible, lead. We have opportunities to inform our members of parliament if we are not happy, okay, about what's going on. So we can actually tell them, and it's still a democracy. We vote them in, right? So that is our solution, right? Thanks.
Yeah, I actually like to add something too. It's an unusual part of my career that I actually find myself at a university. It wasn't the route that I ever thought I was going to be on. But I have to say it's been probably the most inspirational part of my career, for not just for the opportunities it's presented me, but because of the students. And because of an awakening I've had that there is a generation here after us. I'm actually a lot older than everybody else at this table. And I'm very grateful to know that there's this generation after us that is actually really eager to do something. And I had a conversation once with, not that long ago, with John Kelly, who's the Senior Vice President for Innovation at IBM, and I was sitting in his office, and he pointed out to the parking lot, and he said, "What do you see out there?" And I said, "Well, cars." And I thought he was going to try and impress me with a talk about impermeable surfaces and so on. So I said, "What do you see?" And he said, "Kayak racks, bicycle racks." He said, "We have a population of young workers here we've never had before, and they all want to know, what is our company doing that's good for their community?" And I spoke with a professor of mine who's been at Cornell a professor friend of mine who's been at Cornell for a very long time. And I asked him out of curiosity, what's the difference between the students you see now and the students you saw 20 years ago? He's a physics professor. And he said, the difference is that 20 years ago, we used to tell students that science and policy don't mix, that policy contaminates research. He said, now I'm surrounded by students that want to know, how can I make a difference with my science? And here at PACE, in our environmental policy clinic and our master's program, we have students that, given the tools, given the expertise, given the skills and the opportunity, just will do anything to get a law passed, to get a regulation changed. It's part of the great part of their education, and for me, inspiring me. And then, I was happy to see Pete Malinowski here. I've had the opportunity to work with the Billion Oyster Project as Pavan and Nadia, our clinic students, now master's students, have as well, and to work with the New York Harbor School, a terrific, energetic, young, diverse group of sophomores who we had a training session with them here at the school where they're learning how to testify at a legislative hearing. And I've never seen so much energy in one room because they were learning the tools, they were learning the skills. And that eagerness is out there, that hunger is out there, and it gives me a large amount of optimism. I'm optimistic anyway as well. I couldn't sleep at night or get up in the morning if I wasn't. But what I'm seeing is something that media tells you doesn't exist, and it does. I've seen it at all levels and across all kinds of communities. And I think one of the obligations that people like us here at this table have, and people in the environmental movement have, which is a very sophisticated movement, is that we've got to also, in addition to our work, go out into the community like missionaries and transfer our skills. Peter spoke yesterday about a great course he took during your master's program called Tricks of the Trade. And this is what it's all about. How do you testify? How do you write a news release? How do you communicate to a legislator? How do you research an issue? How do you construct a statute? How do you lobby? These are skills that turn anybody who's eager, inquisitive, and half willing to do something into a tremendous advocate for their community. And I've watched how just learning those skills transform students from sophomores right up into to graduate students at our own university. And it's out there. That energy is out there. That intelligence is out there. That commitment is out there. If we can tap it and we can help cultivate it, and that's my big reason for optimism. And the reason I'm not pessimistic is because I'm old enough. I've actually lived through darker political times than these. And was very politically active during those times as well, as a draft counselor and a bunch of other things. And we pulled through. And despite all the odds, we live in a society where people have the right to marry. We live in a society where not only can women hold executive positions, but get more popular votes as a presidential candidate than her opponent. We live in extraordinary times. You can't discriminate because of age, gender, sex, pre-existing medical conditions. There was just a great case 2 days ago. This is all progress that wasn't there when I was 30 or 20. And despite any dark political times, we've made all that happen. And our environmental laws have been attacked many times, and they're still all there, the best collection of environmental law on the planet. So I think our job now is to pass it forward, and look for ways that we can help train that next generation with those same skills.
Can I just say one?
Please do, please do. And then we're going to have to
Okay.
bring up my dean.
I fully agree with you that our future lies in the hands of the young. And it's our job to inspire them and to give them this passion to go forward, right? To do what's good for the environment and for themselves. Now, in Singapore, and I think in most cities, if not all cities, we face this problem of our youth and our young being alienated from nature because it's such an urban environment. Right? But I find that unless they really are exposed to nature and taught to love nature, then they will really care for the environment. And therefore, you have to inspire them when they're young. Bring them, to the green spaces, show them the beauty of a flower, a frog, a tadpole, things like that. And that is our challenge, right? And in the end, I think it is also important to ensure a sense of ethics. And here, there are two very inspiring documents, what we call soft law documents, the World Charter for Nature and the Earth Charter. It's very beautiful language, and it shows, inspires the students to understand that we are not holding any special position. We are just one of the creatures who live on Earth. And all living creatures have to be respected because they form part of the ecosystem with us, right? So we have no right to kill them. We have a right, in fact, because we are more intelligent, to help nurture them and to appreciate them for what they are. So I think we have moved a lot because most countries now do away with wild animals in circuses, right? We do not allow it, animals are not here for our entertainment, right? So that is in itself a transformation, right? And so we have to move further to have respect for our fellow creatures, and in so doing, ensure that our natural environment is harmonized together with our urban environment. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I want to follow up on that to plug something. I'm glad you mentioned that, animals in circuses. Our students wrote a bill called the Elephant Protection Act, which was passed unanimously in the New York State Senate. And it would ban the use of elephants in entertainment in New York State. They wrote it. It was introduced, it was passed in the Republican Senate in 2016 unanimously. It didn't get to the Democratic Assembly because they didn't think the Senate would act on it, but it's been introduced in both houses this session. It has 14 sponsors in the Assembly. It's going to fly through the Senate. I encourage any of you who would like to reach out to your New York State Senator or your New York State Assembly person and ask them to please support the Elephant Protection Act, which would ban the use of elephants in circuses in New York State. And our student Pavan up there, wave your hand. Pavan was one of the authors of the Elephant Protection Act. Yeah, give him a clap. Give him a clap. So I appreciate you mentioning it. This is the kind of work that our university not only allows our students to do, but encourages our students to do, and one of the great sources of my optimism. Final thoughts before we wrap up.
Well, I just would say one thing, and that is, in the last session, the issue of values really came out. I mean, other people talked about it during the day, but I appreciated that thought in the comments of the panelists here. I would simply leave you with, Martin Luther King said, actually paraphrasing someone a century earlier, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Right.
And that's part of my reason for optimism.
Sure.
I'm not going to follow on Peter's quoting of MLK, so I'll just end right there.
Wise, Michael. All right, thank you very much. Oh, of course.
I should mention that Singapore has initiated a cities biodiversity index, which was introduced at the 10th Conference of the Parties on the Nagoya Protocol to the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity. Yeah, and this is a very useful guide because we want to encourage cities to be as green as possible in terms of nature. So that's something I'd like to share with you all, the Singapore Cities Biodiversity Index. Thank you.
Thank you, panel. Thank you very, very much. And now, Dean Herman, bid everybody farewell, or? Oh, okay.
I want to thank all of you, and I just want to briefly introduce Senior Associate Dean Richard Schlesinger, who is the head of our Dyson College Institute on Sustainability and the Environment.
Thank you very much. In the interest of full disclosure, I am not a water expert. My expertise is air quality and air pollution, the other environmental issues. But, of course, it impacts water because many air pollutants end up in the water. Acid aerosols, lead, pesticides being examples. I just want to thank all of the participants, especially John Cronin for being both MC and moderator, Mike Finewood for being moderator of the last session, and all the participants and all the attendees. This is the third summit, but it's the first one that was developed after the initiation of the Dyson College Institute for Sustainability and the Environment. And while the Institute was initially developed to coordinate all of the environmental activities within Pace University across all the schools, including educational and co-curricular, one of the major initiatives is to foster conferences such as these, which we hope with further discussions with the participants will enable us to develop additional educational programs, outreach activities, and research opportunities in various aspects of environmental problems. So once again, thank you very much for attending. Thanks once again for the participants. And everybody, have a wonderful trip home and a good evening if you're staying in New York.
Again, thank you all, and hope we'll see you at our next summit.